Hi everyone, and welcome back into the Comics Lair for our discussion of the evolution of comics from something for nerds only to mainstream blockbuster entertainment. The Comics Lair is sponsored by Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and the Heroes Convention. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott. I'd like to start by asking our panelists to introduce themselves and briefly describe their interest in comics. Jenny, would you like to start?
Sure. Hello, and thank you for having us. This is wonderful. I'm Dr. Jenny Schwartz Levine. I'm the Dean of the School of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences and an Associate Professor of English at Lake Erie College in Painesville, Ohio, where we just started a new minor in pop culture this past fall, so I'm really excited about that. And I've been a fan of comics ever since I was a very little girl watching Super Friends, when I thought if I went outside in my little Wonder Woman bathing suit, I could see the invisible plane. That turned out not to be true. But I've been a fan ever since, and looking forward to talking about things tonight.
Alan?
Hi, I'm Alan Roach, and thank you all for being here and for listening to me in advance. I teach, I'm a professor of English at UNC Charlotte, and I teach a number of things, but I do teach the graphic novel. I was, like probably all of us, very interested in comics when I was a kid, from earlier days, from my DC inheritance, and then had this lapse until, if this may come up, I came across graphic novels, especially through Mouse. And so I'm very interested in, because I'm also an illustrator, in the representation of images and how ideas are transferred through the graphic novel.
Okay. Daryl?
Hello, everybody. Daryl Mansell. I am definitely not a teacher of anything. I am a podcaster, film critic. Like everyone else, like most comics people, I got into comics at a fairly young age, early teens, maybe even earlier than that. Also had a lapse as well, like Alan did, and I think that's a pretty prevalent theme as well. But luckily, I get to pick it back up, and I just love the medium of storytelling that is comics and graphic novels.
Matt?
Hey there, thanks for having me. My name's Dr. Matthew Donahue from the Department of Popular Culture at Bowling Green State University. I'm a musician, artist, filmmaker, writer, and educator in the field of popular culture, and a teaching professor at the Department of Popular Culture. Prior to my work for the Department of Popular Culture, I served as an assistant archivist at the Sound Recordings Archives at Bowling Green State University. Great to be here. And my interest in comics really, again, kind of started when I was a kid. The early Batman television show, just absolutely really kind of got me interested for sure. And definitely a lot of the early Saturday morning cartoons, like the Super Friends, which was mentioned earlier and such. Really interested in kind of the more recent trends in terms of how comics have crossed over into film and created this whole blockbuster movement associated with comics.
Okay. And Chuck?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Dr. Chuck Coletta, also from the Department of Popular Culture at Bowling Green State University in Ohio. I'm also a teaching professor. I'm currently teaching a course on comics and culture and superheroes. I've been doing that for several years. I've been teaching that course, I would say maybe about the last 10 years. And I started reading comics also as a kid, and I never stopped. I still go to the comic book store once a week or once every other week. And I'm looking forward to talking comics with you guys today.
Great, thanks y'all. And I just have a little background for any of our viewers who don't know that comic books actually grew out of comic strips, which have been around since the 1800s. And they had never garnered strong approval. In 1909, an article in Ladies' Home Journal, of all publications, described them as, quote, a crime against American children, close quote. There was a further movement against them after World War I. And some scholars argue that the concern about comic books was not just about what they called unsavory images, but was a reaction to the stresses of urbanization and immigration. So with that as background, what was the attitude toward comic books when you were growing up? Alan, you want to start us off?
I think you're identifying me as the oldest person here.
No intentional
Well,
identification.
way back in the day. No, actually, one of the interesting things is that a problem, this is probably very, very common. And in retrospect, when I think about it, I think that my father probably read about, now I'm just going to blank on his name, the book about how devastating comics were.
Wortham.
Seduction of the
Judge of the Innocent.
Wertheim. He didn't read Wertheim, but he probably read about it in the newspapers. And he was not a very, he was a great father and very understanding, but he was somebody who was very literate. And when he found me reading comics, he was very distraught. Fortunately, he lived long enough to see me become an English professor, and I could sort of say to him, well, it didn't ruin me entirely, and I do Victorian literature primarily, which is what he loved. And he knew that I was somebody who liked to illustrate things, and I would constantly say, I'm learning more about perspective and drawing from reading comic books and from any other source. So I still had to read the comic books underneath the sheets of my bed with a flashlight. And my grandfather was complicit in helping me get, so we snuck out on Friday nights, traditional Friday night dinner, and he would buy cigars, which he wasn't allowed, and I was buy comic books, which I wasn't allowed. But they were, especially Superman, was very, very important, and anybody who had a Jewish upbringing, as I did, and was clearly destined to be a nerdy person, saw in Superman the salvation of one's soul.
Okay, Daryl?
Oh, I'm trying to think back to my earliest. I'm just a little bit younger than everybody else here on this panel. For me, it would be right at the mid '90s is when comics kind of came into fruition for me. Living in Virginia, my dad was military before I was military, and luckily the base that we were at, right off base, there was a comic book store, and that's something that my dad nurtured in me. Mom couldn't really care less about that, but Dad would be like, hey, let's go check out, let's see what the new number ones are, whatever the case may be. And we happened to be there right at the birth of Image Comics.
Nice.
So yeah, it seems like, oh, let's see what this number one's about. Let's see who's this Spawn guy, what's he talking about? And it exploded in my school. I think I was very much right time, right place kind of kid. So there's people talking about it in the hallways. Who's winning a fight between this guy and that guy. So I was very lucky and fortunate to just be, like I said, right place at right time, with parents that also nurtured and fostered my love of creativity and imagination. So that's always good for me.
Matt?
Well, for me, really, it started out with the comic strip. My parents were always very supportive of, what I was into, and I was always interested in kind of creative stuff all along. But when I was 9, I had a paper route, and I delivered the Toledo Blade. Now it's referred to as the Blade. And boy, I just loved, getting first access to that, because what would happen is a bundle of papers would be delivered to my house, and the first thing I'd go and check out was the Spider-Man comic strip.
Yeah.
Which was a daily deal in the Blade, and that was just riveting to me. And I just couldn't wait for the next day and the next edition of the newspaper to find out what was going to happen. And that's what really got me turned on to comics early on as a kid. My parents were always supportive of kind of all my pop culture interests, but in terms of comics, really going back to the early Spider-Man comic strips in the Blade and the newspaper that I used to deliver. And I always loved it too, because I always felt like, I was getting sort of first dibs on Spider-Man, but also some of the other stories and comic strips that they used to have. And I always loved the Sunday edition, of course, because it was in color. So it was really a lot of fun. Great way to be introduced to Spider-Man and then later other comics throughout the years.
Okay, thank you, Chuck.
Well, I'm trying to think back. I was about 10 years old, I think, when the Superman movie came out with Christopher Reeve. And that really sparked me to get into DC Comics and start delving into all that. And as a kid, I collected the Sunday newspapers. I would save them from the Plain Dealer or the Cleveland Press when that was around. I would collect things like Dick Tracy's comics and just about anything I could get my hands on. And I started collecting comics pretty regularly in the early 1980s, just before the Crisis on Infinite Earths. So that's sort of how I sort of get, orient things. Was it pre-crisis or post-crisis? And I sort of never stopped with comics. I was always interested in the evolution of it, how a character like Superman would evolve over time. And I know Jenny is also from the Cleveland area originally, and Superman was created in Cleveland. And so that was always a big thing, that Superman came from Cleveland. You can get the Superman shield on your license plate here in Ohio, which I have. And so it was just something in the culture. It all started here.
Jenny?
Yeah, that's true. And I grew up in a little town, about an hour south of Cleveland. And I kind of had an experience like Matt did, that I got into comics very much through that Spider-Man newspaper strip, because growing up in a little tiny town that they finally got a stoplight after I left for college, there wasn't much in the way of comic book stores or anything like that. So I'd have to get comics, when we'd go to the grocery store and there was the spinner rack. So it was sort of an inconsistent kind of being able to start collecting comics until I was a bit older. But my parents were really supportive of that and loved the Superman movie. And I think part of the reason my mom in particular was kind of supportive of me sort of really being into comics and that kind of thing was that when she was a little girl, she was she passed away a couple of years ago, but she was born in 1942, and she loved the Superman comics. And one of the formative moments of her young life was when my grandmother got rid of them. So,
Oh no.
So Mom was very much into making sure that I got to sort of do whatever I wanted with the comics, because not only was it great to encourage reading, but also because those Superman comics had disappeared when she hadn't wanted them to. So.
Well, I grew up in a small college town, and
cool.
It was spinner racks, no specialty shops. I predate specialty shops by quite a few years. And I was 8 or 9, I think. I was walking down the street with my grandfather, and there was a display in one of the windows of comic books, and one of the covers caught my eye, and I said, "Papa, will you get me that comic book?" And he kind of looked at it, he looked at me, and he said, "Are you sure your mama would want you to have that?" And it was one of those out of the mouths of babes moments, because I said, "Well, she won't care if you buy it." And I still have that comic book. It doesn't have a cover anymore, and it's not in great shape, but it has great sentimental value to me. So as it turned out, my mother was not at all pleased about this comic book thing. My father was okay with it, although every once in a while he would pick one up and read it just to see, what was I reading? Is this appropriate, or at least not inappropriate? And so it wasn't that comics were openly disapproved of so much as that most people in town who didn't read them just ignored it. And, my mother was of the school that said, you should go outside and play because that's better for you than sitting in here reading these weird things. So that was kind of what I grew up with. And so that kind of leads into, what do you think makes comic books, and I'm not limiting this just to superheroes, what do you think makes comic books attractive to readers? Daryl, you want to start?
What makes comic books attractive to readers? I think it's just that serialized storytelling that really makes it attractive. Like, you get to that that last panel of that last page. And if the writer and the artist and the editor have done their job right, then it just makes you want to go, wait that 30 days or whatever it is to pick up that next issue. And I've tried to explain to people, it's just like television. Instead of, a moving picture, you just have to just look at the still image and use your imagination to kind of fill in the rest of the gaps. And when I've explained it to people like that, or what a storyboard from a movie is, well, just think about it like you're reading a movie's storyboard, and that's kind of drawn people in. And I think it's just the being able to use your imagination and find a character to kind of glom onto or insert yourself into that story. All those things make comic books appealing for me, anyways.
Okay, anybody else want to weigh in?
Well, one of the things I was saying, and it was interesting because Daryl made me think about this, is, of course, for me and for probably a lot of us, it was the color and the illustration, and obviously that sense that you would step out of, through this character, you could step out of your own mundane life. But more important, I think, or not more important, but one of the things that always struck me, I used to go to this store when I was in school down the street called Triangles, and we would sit and we could, and it was one of those situations where the owner would say, this is not a library, you're going to buy it or not going to buy it. But anyway, the thing for me, in some sense, is when you're a child, and depending on how helicopterish your parents are, there's no getting away from the constant scrutiny of your parents. There's no, so that in some sense, when you think about dinosaurs and children and wanting to be big and empowered, the same thing is true with superheroes, but it was also that if you put a mask on, or, like even Superman with just glasses, that nobody would know you. You could escape scrutiny. And escape it with enormous amounts of power. And that idea, and it was just prompted by what Daryl was saying, was just, it was something that was deeply motivating for me. It was just like getting away from, and it's not like I had a terrible or oppressive home life. It was quite the opposite. But I did have Jewish parents. And they were paying attention to everything, like to my grades and to where I was going to go, and what was rotting my mind and what wasn't. My father would try, as I said, my father was great. I did, I think I suggested the wrong thing because, but one of the things, like my father would say, you need to read Vanity Fair. Which is not the most, and if you saw a copy of Vanity Fair, it's not the most encouraging thing, even though I love the novel now and I teach it, to say to a 9-year-old. Comic book, Vanity Fair. You make the choice.
Anybody else want to weigh in?
The only other thing I would add is I think it's the characters too, because what I responded to on the top shelf behind me is I have the collection of all the Peanuts comic strips, and I've got the Prince Valiant comic strips, and you just, sympathize and empathize with characters like Charlie Brown or Beetle Bailey or Dick Tracy, and it's compelling stories. Now I did not grow up in front of the computer, and I didn't have a like kids today, but so I don't know if it's different for younger kids with everything on a screen. But it was just, I wasn't escaping from the world. I was just sort of escaping into this world. I loved Archie and Betty and Veronica. I had no idea what high school was like. And so, when you're 8 years old, you sort of think, well, I could do that. Or maybe not have quite as much fun. But,
yeah, it's like being a nerdy guy with freckles. And you think, oh, my life is going to be like Archie's. No.
That's right. It didn't turn out that way. So
for me, it was really the whole kind of, pop culture and pop art-esque of it all as well. I think I just loved the graphics on a lot of the stuff. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the Batman television show, that was just really something that I gravitated towards. I loved all the the crazy colors and the crazy outfits and the cool cars and the cool gadgets and that sort of thing. So it was really a combination of, you know, the comic strip, the comic book, the television aspect of comics, and then again, as Chuck mentioned too, my older brothers worked at the movie theater up the street, and so one of the perks was that, you know, being a young kid, you'd be able to go see movies for free. So a lot of, you know, kind of what Chuck mentioned with the Superman film, I just remember going to see that numerous times, just being, you know, just enthralled and blown away by all of this. And I think, again, you know, the pop art and the pop culture elements really is what gravitated me towards the world of comics as well.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing. I love the way that the art and the words kind of come together to tell the story. So you use your imagination, but your imagination is sort of prompted by the things that you're seeing on the page. And I particularly loved Wonder Woman because, you know, she was this strong, empowered, you know, at least some of what I was reading. I mean, that's not necessarily her entire history, but you know, the strong, empowered woman. And I was of an age that not only was the Superman movie, you know, really important, but when the Wonder Woman television series was on, I loved it. You know, that was, so I could see her, you know, in a comic book, I could see her on my television screen, and maybe someday I could be her, you know. Hasn't worked out.
I don't want to speak too much, but I do want to say something that's just going to both age me but also sort of maybe pick up. By the time when I was so ambivalent about the movies and very ambivalent and actually didn't like the Batman television show, I took the comic books so seriously and was in that world that when they made fun of it by those kind of overbearing kind of farcical moments, I mean, it was fine, you know, to see the Penguin with Burgess Meredith and so on, but it just seemed to me a travesty to take away from the gravitas, and I'm not making this up, the gravitas that Batman had. He was, you know, this was long before the Dark Knight, but to me, he was Dark Knight. He wasn't this, you know, sort of comical, farcical character. So for me, that was actually a point of departure. I wanted to stay in the comic books and not in the world of either the films or the TV, certainly the TV show. And that's what was even true of Wonder Woman. I mean, yes, I was adolescent, and of course I was attracted to the show, but you know, it was too hard to render that world into. It's less so now with CGI, but into that world of television and cinema.
And you know, I was sort of, I grew up watching the Batman reruns, and that was just,
Right.
It was like I just loved it. I mean, right from the get-go. I mean, I've stood in line for Adam West's and Julie Newmar's autographs and all of that. But what I think is that when people say you like Batman or you like Wonder Woman, today it's like, which one? There are so many different versions. Yeah. There's a Batman comic book coming out in the next month or so with Batman teaming up with Scooby-Doo every month. Mm-hmm. And then there's also the Dark Knight. And then there's, you know, comic books aimed at various age groups. There are Batman comic books I wouldn't give to a junior high school kid. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of different versions of these characters out there right now. And so there's something for everybody, which was not the case as much, or didn't seem as evident to me when I was a kid.
Very true.
Well, yeah, sure. If somebody has something to add, by all means.
Yeah, well, Nancy, you know me, and you need to shut me up. But I didn't know this Batman Scooby-Doo thing is, but I do something in my class where I go through definitions of superheroes, and we go through a whole list of all the heroes and what their powers are and whether they have super identity, secret identities, and all of that. And it's an exercise in taxonomy and definition and classification. We go through it, and I inevitably end up, because I know where I'm going to end up, on Scooby-Doo. And I say, well, he's a superhero. And this splits the students into two. And they'll say, no, he's no superhero. And then the others will say, well, yes, he gets them out of a jam and that kind of thing. No, but I said, well, he can talk. I have a very smart dog who can't talk. And the point in some sense, and I think this speaks to what Chuck was saying, and different predilections, is, I say to the students, you woke up this morning, come into class, and you didn't know that inside your head, you either had a pro-Scooby-Doo superhero attitude or an anti-Scooby-Doo, but you did. And you've already formulated that long before we had this discussion. And to some extent, that is fundamental to the way, to my opposition to Adam West as Batman, or, my love of other kinds of comic books. But, we're all walking around with that prefabricated notion of who these characters are. Scooby-Doo always elicits both the best and the worst.
You could start a flame war on Twitter with that question. Did anybody want to add anything to this? No? Okay.
Listen,
well,
Scooby-Doo can toss an entire sandwich in the air and swallow it in one gulp. That's got to be some kind of superpower.
Well, that's definitely a remarkable talent. I can even do that with popcorn. So, but as rosy as things are now, and we started kind of moving in that direction, I think, with the Batman television program, there were some storm clouds on the horizon. Gerard Jones in Men of Tomorrow, Gangsters, Geeks, and the Birth of the Comic Book says that by 1940, comics were, quote, the greatest single unifying element of American childhood, close quote, but were still not respected, and by 1942 were a byword for cultural stupidity. And that and the post-war era kind of led into something that Alan touched on a little earlier, which is the prominent career of Dr. Frederick Wertham and his effects on things. So I'd like to know what you all think made the culture so ripe for Wertham's ideas about comics as the cause of juvenile delinquency to take hold. Anybody got a thought on that? Matt, you want to start?
I'd have to defer I'll let Chuck start because he's kind of the master. He's done a few presentations on the seduction of the innocent. Then I'll follow up with a few comments.
Well, I one of the things I think is that, I should just mention it, and Matt knows this too. At Bowling Green, we sort of talk about popular culture as the culture of everyday life. And there's always some sort of fear over what the new thing is. It's video games, it's punk rock music, it's the internet, and there is always a fear of, my kid is spending too much time listening to the radio. And what are these people who I don't know pumping into my child's brain with these horror stories or whatever? And some of Wertham's contentions look ridiculous today, and they were ridiculous then, but there were comic book burnings, and there were congressional hearings about this. And so it was a tense time, and the industry almost did collapse in on itself. And what I think it really ended up doing was stunting things for a long time. Comics from the mid-50s into the early to mid-60s were kid stuff again. Where lots of other cultural creations, music and movies and television was growing up a little bit, comics was always a step behind, but they eventually caught up.
And I just have to add, that was really sort of the kind of going off of what Chuck mentioned. Definitely the 50s was so representative of this battle between the older generation and the younger generation, and really heavily playing out not only in comic books, but also within, popular music, rock and roll music. And so, it was going on with regards to comics, but other forms of popular culture that the youth were also interested in. And again, kind of picking up with what Chuck mentioned, in that, it just seems that within every, every generation has their thing that pisses the parents off, really. Either pisses the parents off, and it's always a fascinating view. If it isn't the parents, it's the media. If it isn't the media, it's the politicians, and it's or the so-called expert class. So it's always interesting that we find a lot of those kind of similar, societal figureheads, if you will, taking on the attack on these type of youth pop culture institutions. So in the case of rock and roll music, with what people like Elvis Presley was doing, or even even earlier, a lot of the rhythm blues artists, before it was labeled rock and roll, it was rhythm and blues, with people like Fats Domino or Chuck Berry, or with what was going on in comics. And I think also one area, and again, Chuck is the master on this, is the whole the horror aspect of comics. I think also was kind of frightening to people, not to the youth, but to the older generation. I just don't think that they didn't get it.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've always found interesting about Wortham is that, I mean, in addition to the fact that he was sort of stoking these fears that were out there about what's happening to our children, he was a really good salesman, bad social scientist, but really good salesman, and got himself out there in front of a large number of people, which, as Chuck mentioned, culminated in sort of those Senate hearings. And he was a good writer, because if you read Seduction of the Innocent, the writing, like the individual sentences, there's some nice writing happening there. And because it's good writing that flows well, it sort of lulls you along into thinking that maybe the argument is sound. And of course it isn't. But again, it was just that he was just such a good salesman and was able to, and he genuinely believed it. I mean, that's sort of the thing that comes through with Seduction of the Innocent as well, is that he genuinely thought that America's youth was being threatened in this kind of way, and that it was his duty as a social scientist and as a good American to go save America's youth from juvenile delinquency. When you've got someone that became sort of a zealot, really, in some ways for the cause, and was a good salesman and could write well, then we've got the perfect storm of comic book burnings and congressional hearings.
Yeah. Daryl, you're nodding. Did you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I think that pretty much sums it all up. I think it was a combination of ignorance, both willful and unintentional ignorance, as well as an unwillingness to change and grow. And like Chuck and Matt were saying earlier, these things are kind of cyclical, right? It's going to be something new. I already complain about hip hop that's coming out now. That's not music. Blah 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 blah. So I'm becoming that now, and I luckily I can kind of identify that early. But yeah, I think it's that combination of maybe not willing to just sit down and get things from the kids' perspective. I don't know if anybody ever just sat down and asked them, why do you like this? Why do you read? And then have the kid explain it and maybe see it from their point of view. We might not have gone this far down the road, or they just could have tossed that all out the window because he had an agenda. But yeah, I think it's that combination of ignorance and that unwillingness to change and grow with the times that helps stoke those fires.
Well, Alan, did you want to add something?
I was going to say, so as a baby boomer, I'm constantly in this confessional mode. I hate this. But, one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is two things about the 50s, and everything that Matt was saying is true. I think in Daryl as well. I mean, there's just this, in other disciplines, revolution was taking place. I mean, not only the Beatles, but also all the different kinds of music that was emerging then. And then if you think that's when Thomas Kuhn writes The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he's recognizing that, in fact, it's time to overturn things. But all of a sudden, a ton, I was going to use the word, but I didn't want to get edited out, but a ton of us, and this was me in Canada, but were being produced. and what that was an era of prescriptive culture. Dr. Spock, Harry F. Harlow, psychologists who, what were we going to do with all these kids, and where were they going to go, and what would their careers be? How do we discipline a rising generation that seems so so numerous and so out of control, or and to impose control? And Wortham was all about that. I mean, I think that was clearly what he wanted to do, and he was very convincing, as Jenny's suggesting, and a very good writer. But he was also speaking to huge anxiety about the aimlessness, in the same way that, and I don't have any kids, so I can't really speak to this, but people always worry about kids being aimlessly lost in their phones, in their smartphones, and watching watching either weird videos or playing Candy Crush, which probably will date me too.
Well, yeah, out of all of that, we got the Comics Code Authority, that little stamp that, the younger viewers of this panel are going, stamp, what little stamp? Well, because they don't have to worry about that. But then we got the Comics Code Authority, and that kind of got busted in a 1-2 punch by Spider-Man and Green Lantern, Green Arrow.
Mm-hmm.
And do you all think that was an idea whose time came and went, or do you think it was an idea that was always swimming against the current to some degree?
You talking about the just the authority, the Comics Code Authority itself, the stamp?
Yes.
I feel like they were coming from a place of genuine concern, but it never sat well with me. The same. I think that's a lesser degree of what Tipper Gore does with the parental advisory, although I think we can all say that might have been a little bit more necessary. But yeah, it as a kid, when I first heard of what this is, it didn't sit well with me. Maybe because what I was reading, I never saw what the purpose of it was. I mean, if I didn't understand the policing of these fantastical stories that made you believe and use your imagination, that had characters that were wrapping allegories within these superhero stories or whatever. They were teaching lessons and telling you about, life on other parts of the world that you could only imagine. I don't understand why you would try to limit and put that in a box and say, hey, you're too young for this kid, or you need a parent in the room when you read this, whatever the case may be. It never sat well with me. I never understood it.
Yeah. But I always saw sort of the beginning of the Comics Code as an attempt by the comics industry to save itself, really. Because if they didn't do something, then Wortham and sort of all of those other crusaders were just going to run them out of business, and they wanted to be able to, sort of feed themselves and their families. And like Chuck and Matt were saying earlier, that led to, a good chunk of time, 10 or 15 years, where you really had a dearth of good storytelling, and it became kids' fare again, as opposed to what it had been and sort of what it's become since then. And yeah, it was an unfortunate time in the 50s and sort of the early to mid 60s for comics because of that.
And just going off of that, by the time you get to the late 60s and early 70s, and especially that Green Lantern, Green Arrow, where you have on the cover of a DC comic, I think it had the code stamp on it, where the teen sidekick is doing heroin, about to put a needle in his arm, and the audience was changing. Yeah. Comics readers were getting older, and they couldn't read any more stories about Batman and Robin sort of punching the Penguin again, and so the characters started to age just a little bit with the readers. I remember when I was a kid in the early 80s, they had an issue of Teen Titans where they showed Robin in bed with his girlfriend, the alien Princess Starfire. Like, what? And I mean, and it was very innocent, but I mean, that was 10 years late, 10 years on. And I remember, this was, the audience was changing. That would never have happened a few years earlier. And now you have things in comics which would have never happened. You have, gay characters and trans characters, and the comics are reflecting the culture much more than they had in the past. It's not perfect, but they're moving along with the times.
Well, it's kind of like what Daryl was saying, is that the comics code, however well intentioned it might have been, just knocked entire concepts off the board as subjects for stories and was really confining.
Right.
Did anybody else want to add anything to that before we move on?
I just think it's really fascinating, kind of going off of what Chuck mentioned at you know, Wortham would be aghast at what's going on today. I mean, it's just unbelievable, the diversity that's going on in comic books, you know, recently, but just, I mean, in the past 20 years, it's just been unbelievable.
Well, even look at a show which I don't watch anymore. I've seen episodes of, but look at that Riverdale show, right? That's not the Archie and Jughead that I grew up with, when Archie's, you know, making out with the teacher in the van, you know. Things have changed.
That was the thing apropos the comic code, is it was and to some extent Wortham, I mean, is that he was tone deaf, and the culture was rising around everybody. It was, you know, you couldn't stop that rising tide. And so when you're mentioning Riverdale, and I was thinking about it, even when I was reading Archie comics, those many years ago, I mean, there was this question which persisted in a kind of fanzine culture, which is, what's wrong with Jughead? You know, he doesn't seem to be homosexual, but he doesn't seem to be heterosexual. And to some extent, the character that they created, the gay character in the comic book, was in some sense to release the pressure on Jughead, because they didn't want to necessarily seem like they were suppressing part of his identity for such a long period of time. But in a sense, they were. In a sense, the culture knew that something's amiss with Jughead. And that was, you know, that's partly being, and I'm not necessarily saying it was the comic book writers or illustrators, it was that they were under the shadow of the Comic Code Authority.
Well, the Comics Code Authority bit the dust, and we moved on, and we started with the Batman TV show. The camp actually started in the comics. And then in quick succession, comparatively speaking, if you look at the whole spectrum of the years of comics, we got fairly soon after that, Star Wars, Superman the movie, Alien, Star Trek the motion picture, Star Trek the Next Generation, and then with the technology, the explosion of video games. And so for the time that we have left, I'd like to discuss the ways in which you think those different things led to comics really being a dominant form of entertainment as we move through the 21st century. Jenny, you want to start us?
Sure. In some ways, I kind of think we need to make a little bit of a distinction between sort of the comic property and then sort of how it's being deployed. Because if you look at, for example, comic sales for Wonder Woman in 2017, the annual sales, like, I wrote it down. What was it? It was 47,173. That was the top ranked Wonder Woman, the number of comics that they sold. But then you think about, you know, when we have the Wonder Woman movie that came out, I mean, that made hundreds of millions of dollars. So I think that in some ways people have started to almost identify with the properties more than they have with the comics, because you can get Wonder Woman scarves and, you know, superhero stuff and Funko Pops and all of that. So it's become how people are identifying themselves with the merch and the movies and the video games than it is that there's been a run at the local comic book store. And to me, that's kind of an interesting disconnect. So
it's a disconnect on Twitter too.
Yeah.
Also leads to flame wars.
Yes.
If you're on Twitter. Anybody else want to add anything to that?
What I think also was hugely pivotal was, you know, the Batman movie, the one with, you know, Jack Nicholson as the Joker and Michael Keaton. I mean, that was huge.
Yeah.
And not only for the movie, but also for the soundtrack. They like, you know, I worked at a record store for a long time through that period, and I just remember the hype over the movie and over the soundtrack, and who's doing the soundtrack. Prince is doing the soundtrack. And that's like such, you know, Prince was such a major icon at that time. And so again, you know, kind of going off of what folks had mentioned just recently and previously, you know, going from, you know, Batman and the Hulk television shows, Wonder Woman, definitely. But definitely, I think that particular film really helped to kind of blow the door wide open, kind of, because like the door opened and it sort of shut, and then it really opened, you know, with the whole Iron Man, you know, film. But absolutely, it's an interesting idea that our colleague brought up. Is this idea of, you know, folks being introduced to the stuff first, or folks being introduced to the movie first. And I think that definitely plays out for the younger generation as well. You know, kids are introduced to these movies first, but then they go back and, you know, hopefully they go back. And I know that, you know, in some of the younger people that I deal with, they have gone back and gotten into the comics and into the books aspect of it. And another interesting factor also is really the role that I think, you know, public libraries have played in helping to popularize comics and comic books and graphic novels and so on. I mean, it would be, you know, possibly unheard of to have libraries, you know, featuring a lot of these comics early on. Of course, many of them were just the comic, you know, book magazine aspects, but not books themselves. But I think public libraries have played a huge role in helping to popularize the book element of the comic book industry.
And the only thing I would add on to that is that the popular culture, the comics and all the formula literature and the sword and sorcery stuff and all of that, that is just mainstream now. You have Game of Thrones and you have a Hobbit series worth hundreds of millions of dollars coming onto a streaming service. And if you had told me when I was in college, where reading comics was still not a cool thing in the 80s, in my college, but that there'd be you know, the Scarlet Witch would have her own TV show and everybody would be talking about it, or sort of, you know, Sam Wilson, or that your grandmother knows who Tony Stark is now. that maybe Clark Kent they would know, but you know, Tony Stark and all of these characters we're just swimming in this culture. And we are at a peak, I think. I don't know if this can last forever. You know, Westerns were very popular and then they started to fade. I don't think the superheroes are going away, but at the moment, this is popular culture. The stuff that was sort of sidelined in kiddie stuff is now at the forefront.
I want to go back to something that Matt said. A lot of people have attributed the Batman '89 to being what kind of opened a door for things, but I never thought that was the case. I always thought that Batman '89 made Batman a thing again. That helped wash some of the preconceived notions of Batman '66 away. Kind of brought him back to his roots, along with the Dark Knight Returns. But I think I give more credit to Blade than I do Batman. I think you can kind of draw a direct connection from Blade to X-Men to Spider-Man to Batman Begins / Hellboy to Iron Man. I think for me, that's kind of how the linear progression of things has gone. And that's what kind of, and also you're talking about libraries. I think you have to give due credit to Comixology as well, leading the digital age and things. And you say what you want about their impact on brick and mortar stores, but when they throw an end of year sale on it and I can get a graphic novel for $3.99, well, then I'm just going to eat that joint up and buy as many as I can. I know when Comixology sales are coming. That's when I start working my overtime, so I can have a little bit of extra money. So I think the combination of things like libraries and Comixology and getting, you know, we talk about getting the kids on, well, the digital is where it's at. They got their face in the screen. That's how they can read comic books these days.
I'm not concerned with which way you're reading these characters. If you want to read it on a screen, that's cool. Or if you want to listen to it in audio form, or that's fine. But what I'm always hopeful is that a character like Superman, who's been around for 80 plus years, endures. That he is going to outlive me. You know, I was younger than Superboy when I started. Now I'm getting close to Perry White's age, and I'd like to see it go forward. You know, you want it to evolve over time and with the times.
Great Caesar's ghost.
That's right.
All of this is, and I think Chuck said something earlier that's kind of interesting. As I was thinking about, all these characters we haven't mentioned, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and that in some sense, there's what's like a habitus that you slip into, and there are lots and lots of that are available for different people with different approaches. And Matt's right. I mean, we are in this wash. There are lots of characters available, and many of them speak to us. Not all of them do, and not all of them are kind of appealing in the same way. But there is, at least in cinema, there's this opportunity to experience almost everything, every character.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we all hope, since we're, let's say I hope, and this is where you get afraid that you're really becoming your father, that it does return us to some degree of not only textuality, but the textuality of the image, and sort of being analytical about it and thinking about it. And one incident that it came up, you mentioned Alien, Nancy, and I was thinking, I was teaching Nostromo by Joseph Conrad, and one of my students said to me, this was a long time ago when Alien was just coming out, and said, "Hey, that's the name of the ship in Alien." And I thought, wow. I hadn't seen the movie, so I watched the movie, and of course, the movie is just a version of Nostromo, which is a remarkable novel, and so we did the two in conjunction. And of course, all of these people who are writing comic books, I mean, whether it's the Black Panther or all of these movies are I hate to say it, sort of nerdy people like us.
Well, I think that's a great note to kind of wrap up on, nerdy people like us. Is there anything that anybody would like to add before we conclude?
Well, I think, again, kind of, this idea, there's something for everyone, now. And I think that's also what's really, attractive to the world of comics and so on. I think that's also interesting, kind of to follow up on what my colleagues mentioned. I think there's something for everyone, for kids and adults and beyond.
And I would just add, just real quick, that this is a growing field of academic study. Jenny mentioned she has a minor at her university. We have a popular culture department. There's a whole library at our university that's been there for 50 years that collects and studies all of this kind of stuff. So this is now being taken not just seriously by the mainstream culture, but by academia as well. So that's a big change over my lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like to follow up on that, there's something for everyone. And I'm going to go on a limb and say it's probably the people watching this particular panel know this, but the connotation of comic books are superheroes is a stigma that I think needs to go away as quickly as possible. There's multiple genres, literally something for everyone. Science fiction, crime, slice of life. There literally is something for everyone in every possible genre that you can see a movie or a television or read a novel in. They have it for comics.
Yeah, and there's been, I think, an increase in the number of comic books that are literally based on fantasy. They're magic-based comic books. They have nothing to do with superheroes. They have their own worlds, their own magic systems, and you could find plenty to read in a week, like you're saying, and not such a superhero book. There are so many other things out there.
Well, one of the things that Alan Moore did in Watchmen and in V for Vendetta is kind of squeeze the superpowers out of the superheroes, and to some extent, that's what's made the graphic novel. And I'm thinking about, let's say, Emile Ferris's My Favorite Thing Is Monsters, novels that are visual novels, whether it's Mouse or the kind of work that Will Eisner has done, that have, in some sense, are essentially works that encompass us all, they're narratives for us all, but the medium is a different one. And we don't have to, this is, because when we play that superhero, it's all about superheroes, we're playing a game that probably is as old as my father, who didn't know very much about superheroes. He just knew that I was reading Superman and Batman.
Well, why don't we go around and everybody tell the viewers what you're working on and where they can find information about your work. And Chuck, we'll start with you.
Well, I'm currently working on a presentation that I'm going to be giving to the Popular Culture Association conference in about a month. And the topic is the I Love Lucy comic strip of the 1950s that ran for a few years, which has only been reprinted once in 30 years. And it's really interesting. It's an interesting take on the show. And I can be found at Bowling Green State University. And I'm my only social media presence is I'm Dr. Pop Culture BGSU at Twitter. And I'm always posting inane things, so come and see me.
Matt?
Well, gosh, I'm always working on some creative stuff. A lot of stuff recently that is not comics related. I've been doing quite a lot of research on popular culture in the Netherlands. And I recently did a film called the Amsterdam T-shirt Project, which was a documentary film highlighting souvenir T-shirt culture in the city of Amsterdam, which is the souvenir T-shirt capital of the world. I went back to Amsterdam, Netherlands, and I'm currently working on a project called the Amsterdam Sign Project. I went back to Amsterdam, Netherlands after the documentary was completed. I've always been interested in business signs, neon signs, and that sort of thing. And I took over 3,000 photographs of business signs in the central city of Amsterdam. And so I recently compiled an exhibit, and I'm sort of editing that down into book form. I'm also working on a documentary on Skip McDonald, who goes by the name Little Axe. Skip was, he describes his music as 21st century blues music. He was a session player for Sugar Hill Records and played on a lot of the big hits, such as Sugar Hill Gang's album Rapper's Delight, or The Message by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. I've worked with Skip on a number of projects. I'm always working on creative stuff. And folks can find me. I have a personal website at www.md1210.com. So that's md1210.com. And I also have a little YouTube channel called Mad45 TV. And also you can catch me at the Bowling Green State University's Department of Popular Culture website. Always interested in working with people and collaborating and working in different mediums.
Daryl?
Primarily, first and foremost, I am a film critic, so always watching and reviewing movies. You can find my reviews at paprika.reviews.com, like paprika with an O instead of an A. So you can go check out the latest haps on whatever's coming out there. Working on a little something for Blumenthal here in the next couple of weeks here. We're going to be doing something like a pop culture draft. So where a couple of us get together and attempt to draft to certain roles of, will be your literary hero, and who would be your movie hero, to see who can draft the best cast of people. And we just did our Star Wars draft yesterday, as a matter of fact. Other than that, man, that's it. Twitter, you can find me on Twitter at Seedalicious, SEEDALICIOUS. Always talking films, always talking comics. Also, the Paprika logo, neon sign, by the way. I'm sure you'd love it.
Alan?
Okay, well, I recently did a TEDx talk on all imaginary animals are real and all real animals are imaginary, and you can just look it up with my name, Alan, R-A-U-C-H, and animals. And I'm writing a book now, finishing a book, knock wood, about sloths in popular culture and just in general, and their biology. And there's a wonderful book about sloths, a graphic novel called Mimetic by Eric Donovan. So I can be found at UNC Charlotte. I'm working on other projects that are kind of more mundane, but I think interesting, women in science in the early 19th century. So if you look for me at UNC Charlotte, I do have a web page that I'm trying to migrate over to another format so that it's more accessible and more updated.
Okay, Jenny?
All right. Well, first of all, thank you, Nancy, for bringing us all together.
Yes.
This has been a blast. I've had a wonderful time.
Thank you.
So like Chuck, I'm going to be presenting at the Pop Culture Association conference here in about a month. My paper is going to be about the spy comic Velvet, which basically imagines what happens if maybe Miss Moneypenny came out from behind the desk and she was a bigger, badder spy than James Bond ever was. So it's a terrific comic. If you we get a chance to read it, I think everybody enjoy it quite a lot. So I'm on Facebook at Jennifer Schwartz Levine, on Twitter, Dr. Jennifer Schwartz Levine. I think the Twitter handle is Jennifer Schwartz 2. And if you can also find me by looking on the Lake Erie College website, which is lec.edu.
Thank you. And thank you all so much. I've had a blast, and I hope that you all enjoyed it. And thank you for joining me for this panel. And thank you to everyone who's watching. And thank you also to our sponsors, Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and Heroes Convention. And for more information about them, you can go to www.heroesonline.com.